Welcome everyone to this afternoon's Nicec webinar on this marvelous Thursday, the 18th of May, 2023. Today's topic for presentation and discussion is valuing career guidance, value to whom, value for what. Today's webinar offers a broad-based consideration of the resources needed for a proper career guidance system. The focus will primarily be on services provided to young people in schools, colleges, and universities, as the Gatsby Foundation review of adult guidance and the IES Commission on the Future of Employment Support are reporting later in the year. In fact, we are planning a Nicec webinar to cover the crucial topic of adult guidance policy and requirements. So put the 18th of September in your diaries now for the discussions about the work by the Gatsby Foundation and the IES. The topic in September will consider how adults in England deserve a high-quality careers guidance system to help them navigate the ever-changing world of work. The theme for today's webinar will consider what is value, value to whom, and how any consideration of value depends on who is measuring it and what it is that they are measuring. Jill, could I have the next slide, please? By way of introduction, on the screen, you may see some headlines from recent newspapers. And you can see much reference there to the cost of living crisis, to global recession, to the challenges of employment, unemployment, redundancy. All those are the current reality for many people in the UK, but also around the world. Likewise, too, we know both people in the workforce now and those who will be the workforce of the 2030s, as well as our young people today, are facing much uncertainty with regard to their careers and future jobs and current jobs for that matter. Jill, the next slide. And here you can see captured some of the work that's been done over the last few years around, for example, the influence of technology on the world of work and the jobs of the now and the jobs of the future, and how even in the areas around the professions, for example, but across all industry sectors, there are crucial impacts that have a bearing on the kind of support that is needed, in my view, on an all-age, all-stage basis. So for young people in education, but also those in early stages of their career, as well as for adults in the workplace, and those thinking about reskilling and upskilling for the here and now, but also for the future. And perhaps to close out this brief introduction, Jill, I can show you the next slide, which of course sits at the heart of much of the recent discussion about artificial intelligence and ChatGPT and its influence, particularly on the world of work, both very immediately now in the here and now of today, but also in the future. And I heard a reference to a Goldman Sachs report, something like 300 million jobs are at risk or something like that. So there are certainly some serious uncertainties with regards to the world of work and how all people are best supported with regards to ensuring that they can make informed choices around career, around jobs, around transition, around considering a range of options that they face as well with regard to managing their career journeys. In today's webinar, the format today is briefly, we have some presentations from our speakers. Each will speak about 15 to 20 minutes. Then we will have a 25-minute breakout discussion group session for you as participants to gather and work in small groups to discuss and talk and think about the topics that are presented today. We'll have a short plenary report back as well at the end of that, so someone will need to take notes in your groups and report back on behalf of the group, and we should close by 6:30 this afternoon. Now, let me just briefly introduce myself. I'm Keith Herrmann. I'm the facilitator for this Nicec webinar today. I'm a Nicec Fellow. In my day job, I'm a researcher at the University of Cambridge, working on a research project around student communications and engagement. Like many of you, I'm sure, I've had a delightful career journey which has meandered and zigzagged from working in a small business policy think tank in South Africa, which included drafting the National Small Business Act for South Africa, to working at Durham University Business School and the University of Surrey. My experiences range from working with university vice chancellors and CEOs of global companies on topics like our future talent and skills strategy for UK PLC, to initiating the Careers Alliance in partnership with Professor Tony Watts, Margaret Dane, the former CEO of AGCAS, and Vivian Brown from Skills Development Scotland, and many of the colleagues, I guess, who are in the webinar today, to build an alliance of key national stakeholders with an interest in career guidance to inform and influence government policy. Of course, today joining us are our speakers. Here we have with us today David Winter, who is Head of Research and Organisational Development at the Careers Group, University of London. Yes, Jill, could you pop through to the next slide, I think? Thank you. And the next one, thank you. There we go. And you may need to hit the down button just to bring the text up on the screen. There we go. Thank you. Super. David's role is to enable the Careers Group achieve its mission of making its member services the best they can be by putting in place strategies, structures, and systems that encourage excellence. This involves developing the capacity of the Careers Group to undertake and apply research to its activities, encouraging ongoing professional development and sharing of best practice, and ensuring that they have up-to-date resources and innovative methods for delivering their services. In practice, that means he spends a lot of time finding ways to make it easier for talented but busy people to do things that increase their expertise. Our second speaker today is Dr. Emily Tanner. Emily is Program Head, Post-14 Education and Skills at the Nuffield Foundation. Emily leads the development and management of the research portfolio across post-14 education and skills. This includes young people's pathways from school to work, skills, and educational disadvantage. Within Emily's portfolio is a strategic fund program investigating the essential skills needed by tomorrow's workforce. Emily has worked in education policy research for over 20 years, including at the National Centre for Social Research as head of the Children, Families and Work team at the University of Oxford and Yale University, and most recently as head of research at the Careers and Enterprise Company. So, now on to our first speaker, David Winter, who joins us today via a recorded video, as he is currently travelling to Scotland and hence not able to join us in person. Here is David's presentation, and I'll briefly hand over to Jill in the background to load and play the video. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm David Winter. As well as my role at the Careers Group, I'm also a Nicec Fellow. And I'm going to share some thoughts on how careers education and guidance is valued in higher education. I will focus on English universities, partly for time and partly because I want to explore the impact of a metrics-led approach on strategy. Now, apologies to my colleagues in the devolved nations who use a different quality enhancement framework. I'm going to cheat slightly by expanding the question to look at the value of higher education in general. And this is partly because for some people, these two things have become conflated, much to the annoyance of some academics and some careers professionals who think perhaps we should be looking at more than just the intersection of this particular Venn diagram. As I was preparing this session, this poll popped up on my LinkedIn feed from Universities UK, so I'm not the only one thinking about the value of higher education. In the blurb for this event, Keith put in a couple of questions about value. Value for whom and value for what? I'd like to add a third question that we should probably always ask when thinking about value. Value compared to what? Value is relative. There are two aspects to this. One is to do with the reference points and benchmarking for any value metrics that we use, but the other is more broader about the definition of value. What are you prepared to pay or sacrifice in order to get what you value? To explore some of these questions, I'm going to look at various actual and possible interpretations of the value of higher education in relation to careers and employability, covering different arbiters of value and different purposes. Since the introduction of student tuition fees, there has been a consistent move by governments to treat higher education as a marketplace. This was crystallised when the Higher Education Funding Council for England was replaced by the Office for Students, the market regulator for higher education. They have a strong narrative around return on investment and value for money for students, and which seems to place students very firmly in the role of customers. So how do they determine customer value? To be an HE provider, notice that we are providers, not institutions. You have to satisfy the various conditions of registration with the OFS. The condition of particular interest to career services is B3, related to student outcomes. Interestingly, the wording hints at a stakeholder other than the student as being the arbiter of value and the ultimate customer. It's also interesting that despite this flagging of value to employers, the OFS doesn't ask employers about value. And you can compare this to the Australian University Quality System, QUILT, which has an employer satisfaction survey which is very skills focused. The main way in which the OFS measures and enforces this interpretation of value is through the Teaching Excellence Framework, the TEF. In particular, the progression measure, which uses data from the Graduate Outcomes Survey, a snapshot of graduate status at 15 months out. Each institution then has a benchmark which is based on the particular characteristics of the institution and of their students. For this measure, value has been determined by the Office for National Statistics and their classification of occupations, determining which ones are appropriate for graduates. What it doesn't account for is the rapidly changing nature of the job market and the fact that some graduate career pathways take longer to actualise than others. So it's not really a progression measure so much as a snapshot of attainment on an uneven playing field. One strategic impact of the introduction of fees and the increasing emphasis on graduate outcomes has been a certain amount of increased investment in career services, at least in some institutions. But a lot of growth has been in activities geared towards improving that snapshot of attainment. So more employer engagement staff, more placement provision, a focus on skills development and portfolios, and a lot of work on application and interview preparation. Careers guidance focused on making career decisions has taken more of a back seat. Let's stray a little further into the realm of so-called objective value. For some people, career success is defined in terms of income. The Graduate Outcomes Survey does collect salary data at the 15-month point. However, another data set has had significant impact on the narrative around the value of higher education, LEO, Longitudinal Educational Outcomes. This combines tax data from Revenue and Customs and data from the Department of Work and Pensions with study data from the Higher Education Statistics Agency, and then it maps median salaries at various points post-graduation. And it does this by institution and by subject. There are a lot of criticisms of this methodology. See the Universities UK briefing. But one major one is the lack of contextualization. It doesn't account for regional or sectoral variations in income levels, and it only looks at financial value. Despite this, the Social Mobility Commission based a lot of their report on the so-called labour market value of education on this one-dimensional perspective. So let's ask those questions again. Value for who and value for what? The LEO data is behind a lot of the press coverage around the so-called Mickey Mouse degree courses. On the surface, it's presented as concerns about the value for money for students. However, this headline is perhaps a little more revealing. Graduates only start repaying their student loans once their income reaches a certain level. If they don't pay it back, it's the Treasury that has to cover the bill. So maybe that explains why there is such an interest in promoting this very limited view of value. Previously, I mentioned the Social Mobility Commission using that economic value as a measure of the value to students and social mobility. And it is one of the commonly stated purposes of education to facilitate social mobility. In the TEF, there are measures about access to higher education from disadvantaged groups, in which student intake is compared to regional demographics. Most of the TEF measures can be split by various characteristics, which does provide some much needed transparency. As another condition of registration, providers need to have published access and participation plans. As part of this, they are required to explicitly articulate their theory of change, which explains how their actions are meant to achieve their intended outcomes around social mobility. This is a common approach in the development sector for articulating the value of charity work, but has not been so far widespread in higher education careers. As a result of this, many career services have recruited widening participation and diversity specialist roles, or have developed targeted support programs for disadvantaged students. Because of all the various drivers mentioned so far, there has been a growing push to bring careers and employability into the teaching curriculum. Some of the reasons for this are practical. We don't have the resources to give all students one-to-one guidance. But it's also based on the fact that students from disadvantaged or minoritized backgrounds are actually less likely to seek out career support. So we have to go where they are in the curriculum. Another development in this area is the involvement of careers professionals in inclusive curriculum design. Rather than setting up special programs for disadvantaged students, why not redesign the whole student experience to include everyone? And the Careers Group member institutions are already taking part in a project to look at this inclusive design. So far, we have talked about various forms of value which have been presented as being in the interests of students, but which may in part be representing the values of other interested parties. What about the actual subjective value that students place on their career outcomes? One of the inclusions in the Graduate Outcomes Survey that was most welcomed by career professionals was the Graduate Voice question, which gets respondents to indicate their agreement with 3 statements about their current activity, related to it being meaningful, fitting in with their plans, and using what they've learned. This question doesn't form part of the outcome measures in the TEF, despite much lobbying from the careers profession. However, institutions like Leeds University, amongst others, have decided to use the graduate voice outcomes rather than the progression outcomes in key performance indicators for their career service. This focus on what students are learning and what plans they are making whilst at university leads me to another set of data that is starting to be linked to value. Back in 2012, Leeds University also introduced something called careers registration, which has been adopted by around 100 other universities in the UK and overseas. This involves embedding a couple of questions into the student enrolment forms at the start of each academic year. One question asks the students to choose a statement which best describes their degree of career readiness, from "I have no idea what I want to do" right through to "I've already secured what I want." The other asks about employability enhancing experiences such as internships or volunteering that they've undertaken in the last 12 months. This is a progression measure because it allows us to track changes in thinking and behaviour from year to year during the studies. One of the first revelations was that around 40% of students enter their final year still trying to decide what they want to do. And this is across a whole range of different subjects and institutions. Now, this is not a surprise to careers professionals, but it was to many academics and university managers. When you add to that the fact that final year career readiness correlates to those positive graduate outcomes, all of a sudden you have a basis for a renewed interest in the importance of supporting student career decision making rather than just boosting employability and application success. At the Careers Group, we've just undertaken a survey into the implementation of and use of careers registration in UK universities. And it's being used in a number of different ways in the evaluation of services, in the KPIs, and in service prioritisation. And I'm currently overseeing a project to develop a careers registration data hub where we can perform cross-institutional comparative analysis on the data. And Nicec fellow Bob Gilworth is looking at how careers registration is being used strategically within universities in the UK and Australia. So that's something that's starting to be used, at least internally at the moment as a measure of value. I'm now going to explore a few other potential measures of value that are not being used yet, but could be. Student well-being has been gaining prominence as an issue within higher education, particularly following the pandemic, but the focus does tend to be on current students. One controversial inclusion in the Graduate Outcomes Survey was a set of well-being questions. There was a lot of objection to the possibility of being held accountable for graduates' sense of well-being after they've left the institution. How is this a measure of value? Interestingly, but not surprisingly, the graduate outcomes data shows a strong correlation between well-being and the graduate voice question about subjective value. If what you're doing is meaningful and you have a plan for the future and you're using your abilities, you're happier and more satisfied with life. Well, duh. Even more interestingly, well-being increases with salary, but only up to a point, and then it flattens out. The fact that this plateau corresponds to the threshold above which you have to start paying back your student loan may just be a coincidence. So, as well as thinking about value to employers, to the Treasury, or to students, we could also try to think about value to wider society as a whole. Another of our Nicec fellows, Pete Robertson from Edinburgh Napier, has been doing work on the impact of careers work on the UN Sustainable Development Goals, with a particular interesting angle on peace and justice goals. The new Economics Foundation produced a report on the value of various occupations to society as a whole, taking into account both the benefits that they bring and the damage that they do to society. It's not good news if you're a tax accountant. And I think it would be really interesting if this was the measure of value of a graduate career and universities were accountable for this. Another potential perspective on value relates to environmental sustainability. Earlier in the year, I took part in a consultation by the Office for National Statistics, who are attempting to develop a way of classifying the environmental impact of different jobs. In a careers education strategy module I co-designed for the University of London, we have a thought experiment for participants in which we ask them to think about how their approach to careers and employability would change if they were accountable for the positive or negative environmental impact of all their graduates. And this is something that we have discussed in a previous Nicec seminar on the environment, ethics and careers, so go look up the recording. So I've tried to do a little bit of exploring around various different ways in which careers and employability work in higher education is valued, has been valued, and might be valued. And so I'd like to end by posing a few questions for you to think about. So the first one of those is, how do you tend to conceptualize the value of careers work? What assumptions do you make about who and what is important in determining value, and compared to what? And then what do you think are the implications of different valuations for policy and the decisions that are made, for practice and the priorities that we give to different activities, for research and the kinds of questions that we ask, and for professional education in terms of the ethics and the values that we promote? So I hope you enjoy the rest of this session. Sorry that I couldn't be here, but hopefully I'll catch up with you at some other point to discuss value. Hi, I'm David Winter.
That's super. Thank you very much to David there for his thoughtful and thought-provoking presentation, and also, I guess, contextualizing careers education, career guidance in a broader context, a much broader landscape. I quite like that framework that he's used. It's certainly a lot better than the what percent of your graduates are in graduate level jobs. That seems to be the one and only proxy measure of the value of career guidance. Now, of course, today's discussion is also being set in a broader context across the education and adult skills development sphere. I can reference, for example, the work that's being undertaken at the moment by the Education Select Committee, which is running an inquiry at the moment on the effectiveness of careers education in IAG. I do recall, for example, when the Gatsby benchmarks were launched, there was a sort of side appendix that speculated the potential cost of all secondary schools, in this case in England, meeting the 8 benchmark statements of the Gatsby framework, and it was suggesting something like we would need approximately 190 odd million pounds a year to fund that type of activity in our secondary schools. So with that sort of broader context in mind, I'm going to hand over to Emily now to do her presentation. Emily, over to you. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks very much, Keith, and thank you for inviting me here today to join you. I'm just going to open up my slides so that we can get going. Okay, so hopefully you should...
That looks great, Emily.
Yeah, I'm just going to move my notes. Super, great. Well, thanks very much and great to be here. As Keith introduced, I'm Emily Tanner and I'm from the Nuffield Foundation. And for those of you who may not be familiar, the Foundation's mission is to advance social well-being by funding research across the UK that has capacity to make a difference to people's lives by influencing policy and practice. And my particular role is overseeing research that spans post-14 education and skills into employment. So I'm conscious that there are lots of different ways to approach this topic, but I've decided to focus my presentation on how we measure the value of career support for young people, and then turn to how we use evidence to improve the value of career guidance. And I'll link this to the Foundation's funding priorities and to some of the research that we have here. I'm conscious that I'm speaking to an expert audience and that you may see these issues differently, so please gather up your thoughts as we go and we'll have plenty of time for discussion at the end. So picking up on David's approach as well, these core questions to the session. Broadly speaking, I would argue that there is strong consensus on the value of career support for young people among educators, among employers, government and young people themselves. Obviously, I'm speaking to the converted here, and I'm not going to go into all the evidence around that. But what I think that part of the reason we're having this discussion today is that it's not straightforward to articulate value. When we get into the specifics, it's not always clear which aspect of career guidance we're talking about and for what, because the potential benefits are so many and varied. And this has a knock-on effect on protecting resource when time and budgets are tight. And as a result, the evidence base looks quite disparate around career guidance for young people, certainly very different, for example, from the Education Endowment Foundation toolkit that assesses the relative impact of different interventions on attainment. So I'm interested to consider what some of the challenges are around measurement and demonstrating value and what it might take to develop the strength of evidence. So I've picked out three broad categories that help to explain some of the challenges in measuring the value of career guidance. And the next few slides are very much my personal view based on my experience of evaluation and analysis and my reading of the evidence. So I'll go through each of these in turn. So starting with intended outcomes, I would say that since the intended outcomes of career guidance, that is, what are we trying to achieve by doing it, are many and varied, we stand the greatest chance of being able to measure and articulate value when we're clear on what it is we're trying to achieve. And the good news is that we have some strong conceptual frameworks for outcomes, thanks to the work of many Nicec colleagues and others. When we think about impact, say, of resource and investment on provision, the Gatsby benchmarks articulate what we mean by high quality provision. I know there's a review underway to stress test the framework some years on from its establishment, but there's consensus about the underlying principles. We also have frameworks for career readiness when returning to young people and their outcomes, such as the CDI 6 learning areas and Skills Builders 8 essential skills. When we turn to transitions and employment, it gets a bit more tricky because a successful transition will, of course, look different for each young person, and it's difficult to track on a national scale. Is it about progression, attainment of level 3 by age 19, or satisfaction? And with employment, although there are some basic features of good employment, again, what a successful career is will look different for each person. So it's challenging, therefore, to agree common long-term intended outcomes for the system as a whole. And that's why we often end up with a reductionist approach that focuses on unemployment or earnings. So I think it's really important that we continue to debate and discuss this point. So targeted interventions based on a clear theory of change and evaluated with robust methods allow us to explore the value of career guidance with more specificity, both in terms of the activity itself, the input, if you like, and the outcomes and impact. And here I'm thinking of approaches such as an employer-led mentoring programme aimed at re-engaging Year 11 boys with their GCSEs, or a programme of workplace experiences to inspire Year 9 girls to consider taking computer science GCSE. There's plenty of national and international programme evidence, but less compared to other areas of education, and particularly less when we're looking at high standards of evidence, so evidence which really stands up to scrutiny and can inform investment and so on. There are programme evaluations underway where providers are thinking really deeply about the intended outcomes of different aspects of career guidance for specific groups of young people. And those are mentioned at the bottom of this slide. I can say more about that if you're interested. But I would say that there is potential for much more work in this area, including in relation to digital technologies. One of the areas where we can improve the quality of evidence is in how we measure outcomes. There are always limitations and trade-offs in measurement, but I would advocate for a few points I'm going to run through here. I would say that impact evidence is often stronger when it includes measures of actions and behaviour alongside attitudes. So although attitudes, knowledge, aspirations are really important precursors, steps along the way, intentions don't always follow through into action. And attitudinal measures can be quite unstable, meaning, you know, if you measure at different times, you might get different results. So, for example, capturing data on post-16 pathways is stronger than only finding out the intention. On timing, the more proximal the outcome is to the intervention, the more straightforward it is to link the two. So it's often helpful to capture an immediate outcome from an intervention, but it's also useful to follow up sometime later to see if the gains are sustained. And in terms of long-term outcomes, theories of change are really helpful because you can test each part, each linkage in the pathway more easily than the whole model. Surveys are a great way of demonstrating, of measuring bespoke specific outcomes if extant data isn't available. But to demonstrate the value of career guidance robustly, we need more representative and random probability samples and good question design. Without these features, results can be misleading. And then qualitative evidence is important for explaining outcomes and needs to be balanced with sample designs that capture a range of perspectives rather than sort of cherry picking aspects. Then the third challenge that I've observed in measuring and articulating the value of career guidance for young people relates to attribution. So if we just observe changes in our intended outcomes, how can we know and demonstrate to others that the change is due to the career guidance intervention rather than other influences that contribute to maturation of young people more broadly? And this is where we need high quality data and sophisticated analysis. So longitudinal data studies, cohort studies, are an important data source for identifying attribution because they typically allow for other influences to be controlled statistically. And if I was to think of an example, you might look at the analysis of British cohort study by Chris Percy and Elnaz Kashef-Pakdel, where they were able to isolate the influence of career talks on employment outcomes and be confident that wasn't due to other factors. But we also have more recent cohort studies, including the Department for Education's new Education and Outcomes panel studies that track cohorts through secondary schools. And this is a really great opportunity where we can add questions on career guidance to high quality panel studies. The data is much more powerful than small scale bespoke surveys. Administrative data, as David mentioned, is also becoming increasingly powerful for tracking outcomes from education by linking all different aspects of employment and education. In time, maybe it will be possible to link school and college career guidance with later outcomes or even student level experience. And then I wanted to mention RCTs and quasi-experimental designs, because this is where we have a counterfactual. We can see what would have happened without the intervention. And I was thinking that since the establishment of the Education Endowment Foundation, the use of RCTs has become standard in education research, and the quality of evidence has grown hugely. In career guidance, such evidence is still relatively scant in the UK, and I would say very much needed. I'd welcome your thoughts on what it would take overall to coherently build the quality of evidence using some of these methods, and indeed whether other countries have put more focus on some of these approaches. So moving on now to what we fund at the Nuffield Foundation, you'll see here that these are our priorities, and young people's pathways and skills, including with a focus on those from disadvantaged backgrounds, is very much at the heart of the Foundation's funding priorities. And I'm not going to go into great detail on all of those areas, but you can find a lot more detail on our website. And also last week, we ran an outreach webinar, which is now recorded and you can play it back. So when I finish talking, I'll pop some of those links in the chat so that you can follow up later. But what I wanted to turn to now, having focused on the challenges in demonstrating and measuring the value of career guidance, I wanted to turn briefly to think about how we can use evidence to increase the value of career guidance. Research can play an important role, not just in evaluating what already exists, but continually increasing our understanding of young people and what they need from career guidance. And I'd like to share just a small selection of findings from research projects funded by the Nuffield Foundation that provide this kind of insight, and then we can think a bit about how we use such evidence afterwards. So this first study, led by Ruth Lupton at the University of Manchester, investigated the 2/3 or so of young people who achieve below grade 4 in English or Maths GCSE. And it was looking at their characteristics, their other attainment that wasn't English and Maths, and their pathways, what they went on to achieve. And what it really demonstrated for me, I found this very powerful when this was published a couple of years ago, really demonstrates the need for more intensive career support for young people who are at risk of lower attainment as they approach the end of school, not just with career decisions and self-awareness of skills, but wider well-being. It really sort of showed the pressures on young people who are facing more complex choices if they're not staying on in a school sixth form, perhaps having to make critical decisions about careers if choosing vocational options, and also experiencing the pressure of GCSE study when it's not straightforward for them. So I think it very much chimes with the Gatsby benchmark framework, but within that really underlines the importance of tailoring, differentiation, and some students receiving more support than others. A second study about care leavers, led by Neil Harrison from the University of Oxford, explored the high proportion of care leavers who are not in education, employment or training in early adulthood. It was trying to understand what are the drivers of that, what are the explanatory factors, but also what are some of the protective factors. And what they found here was that extended support from the virtual school, as well as some opportunities to engage with employment, pre-employment opportunities and pre-apprenticeship support, was really valuable in helping young people engage in the labour market. And they developed quite a lot of recommendations. It's really worth a look. Again, I'll put the links to these projects in the chat when I'm finished. It showed as well how more research is needed into care leavers' use of further education as a pathway, how they use that pathway, and the effectiveness of labour market engagement programmes. And then the third and final example I wanted to share is a very different sort of project. This is a large-scale piece of work under our strategic fund that's investigating how the demand and supply of essential employment skills is likely to change over the next 15 years and how these skills could be developed through the education system. And the team is working, led by NFER, is working with local areas to provide data to help inform local skills improvement plans and the development of education and training provision to really ensure that young people develop the essential skills that they need alongside technical skills for future work. And in terms of career guidance, the relevance there is that it really underlines the need for skill development to be embedded alongside academic learning through the curriculum and with frequent opportunities to develop skills through workplace experiences and so on. So that's me coming to an end. And I know, Keith, you said you have some stimulus questions as well. Here were just some that I thought might be interesting and would really appreciate your thoughts on. How can we stimulate programme evaluation that results in those higher standards of evidence where they really stand up to scrutiny and can really be used to inform resourcing decisions? Secondly, how can we better integrate research evidence into career guidance design? So the sort of knowledge mobilisation piece and the engagement between research and practice. And then what do you see as the key evidence gaps in career guidance for young people? What would you like to see research focus on? What's needed? And then when the slides are shared later, there's this final one that gives you some links so that you can find out more about some of the work that I've talked about in the Nuffield Foundation. Thank you.
Emily, thank you so much for that. Good. Now we have an opportunity for you as participants to engage with the two presentations, and we're going to have a series of breakout groups for you to go into smaller groups to chew over, to discuss, to consider the questions being posed and the evidence presented by our speakers. We'll do this for about 25 minutes and then come back for a quick short plenary feedback session, and also for Emily and myself and others to also take some of your questions as well that you may have on particularly on Emily's presentations, as David's not with us today, but also you can certainly pick up on themes as participants from David's presentation as well to bring back into the plenary session as well. So while Jill is very kindly setting up the breakout groups, I also wanted to also just thank Emily there for reflecting on and highlighting the importance of having a theory of change and having proper structured evaluation metrics in place to consider and evaluate and measure the impact of career education, career guidance interventions, across the education system. And of course, also framing this or contextualizing this within the broader aspects of, I really love that project that you've got, Emily, there around looking at the skills that young people need for the future workforce and how careers education and career guidance feed into the educational experience, but also need to sit alongside the whole sort of, I guess, skills development, skills building process to equip our young people for their future careers and future jobs. So some really fascinating insights there. So thank you for that. And of course, highlighting the big elephant in the room in the way is attribution, which of course in this particular space is a real challenge. So Jill, as we move forward, can I just check with you how are we doing in terms of moving into the breakout groups?
Yeah, all good, ready to go.
That's super. So we will see you back here in 25 minutes. Enjoy. Introduce yourselves very briefly, perhaps use the chat function for that as well in the discussion, and get to grips with both the questions that David has put to you as well as those questions for consideration that Emily suggested as well. Now to breakout groups. Thank you, Jill. Almost there. You will soon receive a little note on your screen about a group you can be joining shortly. There we go. And Maximus.
I've actually put Emily in room 1 by mistake. Shall I hook her out again?
Leave her there. I'm sure people will take the opportunity to discuss her presentation with her.
Yeah,
that's quite fine.
We didn't agree that, did we?
Indeed, no worries at all. Do you want to stop the recording now and then start it again, or or do you just want to leave it running for 25 minutes? But if so, I will need to edit the video.
I'll stop it.
Marvelous.
Or pause it.
Oh yes, pause. Yes, oh sorry, not now. People coming back into the room. Good. Just waiting for folks to navigate their way back into the plenary space. It's also lovely to see videos on as well, so we can say hello to everyone. Everyone can say hello to everyone else. Good, good, good. I think the system does allow a minute for people to come back into the room, so we may just need to wait a few seconds. I'm sure some of the groups may still be frantically finishing up their discussions.
Yes, we ended up just focusing on one question around the conceptualization of career guidance.
That is fantastic. I love that. Thank you, Emily. Yeah. And there we go. People joining the room. That's marvelous. Good, good, good. Super stuff. I'm going to wait another 20 seconds or so, then we can move. So what I'd like to do for this closing session is obviously call on the groups to feedback to all of us gathered here, but then also provide the opportunity for folks to either put in the chat and or to come online by raising your hand to ask Emily a question, for example, about her presentation, but also happy to take views and contributions and questions about David's presentation as well. Super. So could we have a report back from group number 1? Jill, we need to also think about who was in which group. So does anyone know which group they were in terms of group number 1?
Group 1 was Caroline, Emily, Helen, Maximus.
Marvelous.
And Noya.
Very good.
Thank you. I said I would feedback on behalf of our group. So we just went deep into the conceptualization of career guidance. So I popped David's questions and mine in the chat, and that was the one that got us thinking. And we had quite different perspectives. It was really, really interesting. And Maximus, who joined us from, you are back, Maximus. I know your battery was running low. From South Africa, was talking about the focus on the transformative egalitarian approach and those who are marginalised in society. And actually, that theme of levelling the playing field was quite a strong one, but also just really helping our people identify what they want for themselves, giving them space, having the step back. And that's a personal space. So that was really the essence of what we were focusing on.
Emily, thank you very much for that. And thank you to the group as well. I really love the use of that phrase, which is so powerful, that the transformative value of career education and career guidance in everyone's lives, all age, all stage. That's marvelous to hear. Good. Group number 2.
I can chip in some comments.
Thank you, Pete.
I think one of the big issues was just how difficult it is to capture the value, and particularly for our profession, maybe compared to other professions, particularly elusive to capture the value, and many difficulties in that. One is that the lengthy timescales on which the impact of education and guidance interventions may play out. And some of the outcomes we might like are less tangible. For example, we might want to broaden people's ideas about potential careers they could explore, rather than thinking in tramlines about just one industry, and that's not an easy outcome to capture. Echoing the diversity issues raised by the first group, also that evaluation is very valuable. It's doable, but it is onerous, it is demanding to do, and we sometimes lose the knowledge we've gained from evaluations by not sharing it and making it accessible to other institutions.
Pete, thank you for that, and I'm really pleased, but also I'm sure you're all likewise concerned about the challenge around trying to get an understanding of value, and also in as broad a possible as way, rather than, as you say, in this narrow configuration that we too often in the policy domain in particular we get imposed on us as a sector. Group number 3.
We had a discussion around the questions, I suppose. We had some thoughts about impact of research and evaluation generally. So that was quite interesting in terms of perhaps thinking that any activities that we do, the impact might be seen later, and how sometimes we have to get results quite quickly on some of the activities that we do. So some of the work that I do, the Office for Students, want to know exactly what the impact was, and it's quite quantitative. So we had an interesting discussion about quantitative and qualitative research, and it would be nice to have more qualitative research, and whether policymakers would fund that. Perhaps there's more of a drive for numbers and statistics. So those were our sort of thoughts. I hope that summarises it, Group 3.
Super. Thank you very much for that, Kate. Really appreciate it. Very good. Did we have a group number 4?
Yes, that was myself, Rachel and Sarah. And this was an area that was less familiar to me. So really, it's a really great roaming discussion that we had, learning a lot as well from Rachel and Sarah sharing their experiences. And in the conversation, we were talking about the importance of valuing attributes and the return on investment, and how we've done that before in the experiences that we've had. We talked about how it's difficult to measure the soft skills, and that in some ways it's easier to measure the educational attainment and the careers guidance, almost like the harder measures. We also then moved into the point about who is doing the judging in terms of the value, so the different stakeholder groups, and how the power of those stakeholder groups have evolved through time, and perhaps how the power of the employer is reducing slightly in that context. And then in terms of ideally, how would we want to measure value? It's really about getting a balance of the service provided, the educational attainment, and the actual attributes demonstrated as well by the individuals, and actually the destination of the individuals. And then also Rachel was sharing how it would be great to encourage a reflective practice, to actually put the power in the individual. But obviously that's quite challenging to fund that. So very, very good discussion, very roaming discussion.
Matthew, thank you very much for that. And interesting what you were saying there also around trying to capture value reflects on some comments that I think Kate was making around how do we balance and bring together both quantitative evidence and data, as well as sort of qualitative explorations and evidence of the power and the impact of our careers, education, career guidance in people's lives, and be able to articulate and express that in a way that policymakers and a broader network of stakeholders can understand and have access to, and be used to inform thinking, whether that be for practice or whether that be for policy making. Super, thank you for that. And Jill, can I just check, group number 5, are we at the end of our groups, is what I'm guessing?
There is a group 5.
Oh, marvellous, yes. Very good. Group number 5.
I'm guessing that might be us. I'm not clear about our numbers.
That's right, Janet. Yes, you, Alexandra, and David.
Thank you very much. Yeah, we had a really interesting conversation that was helped no end by Alexandra making the very helpful point that because we're a cross-disciplinary activity, and we could be measured, as I guess other people are saying, quantitatively or qualitatively, because we're psychology, economic, sociology, it means that we're measuring ourselves in very different paradigms. So I think that was a helpful start to our discussion. And then David very much focused in on this, or began to focus in on the idea of why do we need to justify ourselves exactly? And perhaps, as I think someone said earlier on, maybe other professions don't need to do it. And so there was a question that then led on to some really useful thoughts from David about, could we not really think a bit more about what are we contributing, what is our investment, rather than how much do we cost? So those were the 2 areas I think I'd like to pick up from our group.
Thank you for that, Janet. Yes, certainly in terms of valuing the investment needed, or valuing the the activity itself beyond cost is, I guess, the challenge that we face as a sector. And certainly, if one considers our discussions today in the broader context of what I referenced earlier around the current Education Select Committee's investigation into the effectiveness of career guidance in some of the sessions that I've watched in that inquiry, there've been lots of questions about, so, how do you measure, how can we evidence, how do we demonstrate the impact of employer engagement and or careers education in the curriculum, and or bringing other experts into the educational setting for our young people to help them make informed choices. To close out our discussion today, and before we get there, I'm just going to pose a question which I'll come back to at the end, because I also want to just leave opportunity for Emily to also offer some reflections, and or colleagues, if you wish to raise a hand, to ask Emily specific questions. And that is, my question, of course, is what is the power of ChatGPT in this environment? And are we all out of a job as a result of that, as careers counsellors, career guidance experts, careers advisors, etc., careers educators? Emily, over to you for some short reflections while I watch the screen to check if there are any questions for yourself coming through as well.
Okay, thanks very much. And just to say, I've just popped the links in the chat to the things I was referring to in my talk, so do feel free to follow up if you want any more questions on that. I think I'm really struck by the last point that was made about the cross-disciplinary nature of career guidance and what that means for the paradigms through which we think about value. And I think that's important to take away, because it sort of speaks to the complexity, I think, and that's what I think there aren't any easier answers to this. But I was also really interested in what David said about why do we need to justify, because if we look back, if we pick up on that research that I mentioned, about 40% of young people not getting what the country considers to be the basic level of English and maths. We don't shut down schools because a metric hasn't been achieved. We understand the complexity around that and the different needs of people. So, but I'm not sure that argument washes so easily with those who hold the purse strings.
Emily, thank you so much for that contribution and short summary there for us. I'm also just going to read, in fact, out of the chat, for the purposes of the recording, the comment made by David Morgan, where he says in the group that he was in, we discussed changing the discussion from how much does career development cost to, if we invest in career development, what wider social and economic challenges can it address? That makes it a much more valuable lever for government. And I certainly echo those sentiments there. In terms of how we reconfigure this discussion and this debate about the value of career education, career guidance, and I would suggest on an all age, all stage basis, again, to connect this conversation, this discussion to the wider and broader challenge about how we develop a system at a policy level and in practice that connects education, skills, and training on an all age, all stage basis, that we make sure that we do emphasize the adult guidance piece as well. And of course, as I mentioned in my introduction, now, of course, I'll repeat again in my closing remarks that on the 18th of September, we have another Nicec webinar where we will be considering the topic of adult guidance and taking into account and consideration for discussion and debate the findings from the work of the Gatsby Foundation's review of adult guidance, which has been undertaken by SQW in partnership with the Gatsby Foundation, and of course the IES's work around the Commission of Future Employment Support that it will also be reporting later in the year as well. So hopefully that's also a longer term ambition that we can have with regards to informing and influencing policymakers to consider these issues in the round, rather than segmenting it into young people and adults and others. Are there any other thoughts and contributions, observations? Caroline, I can see you holding your hand up.
Yeah. Yes, I was looking for something to put my hand up, and I don't know if there is, so I just thought I'd do it that way. Actually, Emily, I thought you said something really interesting, and I just sort of sparked a thought for myself about, why do we need to justify ourselves, and how, we don't shut schools down even if the attainment is not as it ideally should be in sort of basic subjects. And I just wonder whether something that's kind of occurred to me is, I think for some people, possibly, you know, the powers that be, government, you know, policymakers, the idea of people having choice about jobs they do is actually a little bit scary, because structurally we need to fill certain posts to keep the economy going. And there's the whole debate at the moment around skills, or what skills we're lacking. And so it's almost as if the idea of everybody having total free choice would be a little bit scary in a way. You know, I mean, that's a kind of a very big idea, I suppose. But I wonder if there's a certain resistance there, you know, to the idea of choice and social mobility. I don't know. It's just a thought that occurred to me.
I mean, I've never thought of it in those terms, I have to say, but I do think, you know, I mean, you all as practitioners will be experiencing that tension between what the narrative is that comes out of government, and, you know, which are the pathways that are considered the right pathways, and where are the skills gaps, and then how you balance that with the needs and aspirations of young people, where it doesn't naturally, you know, all link up.
Exactly. And I think it's something I've never thought about in those terms either. That was just sort of how I kind of reacted to what you said. But I just think effectively, yeah, you know, we do have a government who seems to be particularly, well, not particularly favourable towards universities. And, you know, there's sort of the idea that certain subjects don't have value. So I think, you know, that's just a next step, that we only need certain things to do certain jobs for the economy, rather than, you know, the idea of personal choice.
Super, Caroline. Thank you very much for that helpful contribution and those thoughts about encouraging a wider range of choices across all aspects of our lives, particularly with regards to careers and career trajectory. As we know, as I referenced at the start, career journeys often zigzag and meander in all sorts of directions. There certainly is no one linear pathway these days, even though much of the thinking often is framed like that. Finally, from my side, let me take this opportunity to thank David and Emily for their presentations. Thank you for your involvement this afternoon. And one final observation from me, 2 points. One is, I think we should also consider, certainly in an England context, the excellent frameworks and policies that are in place in Wales and in Scotland, and to some extent Northern Ireland as well, as we consider the direction of travel with regards to career guidance, career education on an all-age, all-stage basis here in England. I think there's lots of good practice and policies in the devolved nations which we really need to examine and embrace and take on board. And then my last observation, it goes back to the point about Chat GPT. I'd be curious to see if we took all the evidence that was submitted to the Education Select Committee and churned it through the Chat GPT swanky AI tool, what it would come out with in terms of a structure, a framework, a way of thinking about the value of career guidance and careers education, all age, all stage. So thank you, everyone. Hope you all have a marvelous evening. Thank you so much for attending. Goodbye and keep well. Thank you. And welcome again to our next Nicec seminar in the future.